This quarter, normally, the Gospel Advocate has three of the quarters on the New Testament and then maybe a quarter on the Old. Or if it is two quarters on the Old Testament, it'll be widely differing places. But this time we decided to do all of Genesis a half of a year, two quarters put together. And so we have done the first quarter now and are ready to begin with the second quarter. So it's a little different, but we've started a week behind what the dates in the quarterlies are. And so I think I've been promising from the beginning that I was going to skip one of the lessons, but I haven't so far. And so we are today looking at the birth of Isaac and the end of Ishmael. A little bit more will be said about Ishmael and Hagar, and then the birth of Isaac, and of course Isaac is the promised son. Just for your interest, Isaac is said, Ishmael is said to be 14 years older than Isaac, and so he had been around several years before Isaac is born. I thought we might spend a little time at the beginning of the lesson this time talking about how Genesis unfolds, how the story unfolds. You remember in the first chapter, we have an emphasis on the power of God. He speaks and brings the world into being, and all of the animal life and all the plant life and so forth. God is creator in Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, there's a kind of repeat of God's work in creating the earth. There is a repetition, or it tells in Genesis 2 about the Sabbath day. God rested on the Sabbath day. And then it tells about the man and woman being created for the Garden of Eden. And so the second chapter, when compared to the first, has a lot more to say about God and his relationship to humankind. But as you know, in the third chapter, sin comes into the world, and that's what the third chapter is about, at the beginning of sin. The fourth chapter you might remember in terms of Cain killing his brother Abel. And then the fifth chapter is genealogies. The sixth chapter of Genesis starts with the flood, and so chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9, 4 chapters, are about the flood in Genesis. But chapter 10 is about the genealogy of Noah's descendants, and so we might count chapter 10 with the previous chapters or with a later portion of the book. In chapter 11, there is a chapter that I like to look at. I think that there are several parallels between chapter 3, the beginning of sin, and chapter 11, which is about the building of the Tower of Babel. But it's also in chapter 11 that we are first introduced to God's changing his relationship to humankind down to one family. God deals with one family after the end of Genesis 11 and the beginning of chapter 12. In Genesis 11, Terah is introduced. You remember the father of Abraham and how he dies in Haran, which is a large city, but considerably up the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, in a direction that would be northwest mostly. And then Abraham is called out of that region. He crosses the river Euphrates. For a long time, people thought that the word Hebrew meant the one who crosses over the river. But nobody really holds to that theory anymore. Still, it will come up now and then as somebody looks at an older dictionary or something that to the Bible. Most people today don't believe that that is where the word Hebrew comes from. But Abraham comes down with Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, toward the land of Canaan, still traveling south, now only a little in a westerly direction, until they come to be in the land of Canaan. Eventually, Abraham is going to settle in the south of the land of Canaan, somewhere in the area of Hebron, if you want to look that up on a map. But he stays for some time building altars and worshiping God along somewhere where the northern and southern kingdom would have divided at a later time. But we in Genesis chapter 12, we read about Abraham and the famine that came, and Abraham and Sarah and Lot traveling toward the land of Egypt. That's in chapter 12, 13, and it's in chapter 14, actually, that Lot is captured by some people from Mesopotamia, and Abraham gathers together an army and goes and rescues him. And for the first time, Jerusalem appears in Scripture. The king of Jerusalem, or the king of Salem, is mentioned in the Genesis, the 12, 13, 14th chapter. After that, God repeats the promise that he's going to give Abraham and Sarah a child. The king of Salem was Melchizedek, and he, of course, is mentioned in the New Testament. He is called priest of the Most High God, which, of course, makes you wonder how many there were besides Abraham and Sarah who worshipped God faithfully. Melchizedek is spoken of in the highest way. He is a priest of God. But the promise to Abraham that he's going to have a son, that he and Sarah will have a son, is repeated in chapter 14. And in the chapters that follow, Hagar comes into the picture, because while they were in Egypt, Sarah apparently took a slave girl, Hagar, which then bore a son, who then bore a son, Ishmael. I like the name Ishmael. It occurs now and then. I find it most often in works of fiction, but Ishmael is a good name. It's the word Shema is in it, which means hear, and the yod is put on the beginning, Ishmael. The yod, I'm not going to get into Hebrew grammar here, but it means he hears, or let God hear. That's what the word Ishmael means. And so for a time, Hagar and Ishmael go back and live in the house with Abraham and Sarah. But when the time comes that Sarah is actually to bear a child, she doesn't want Ishmael around any longer. Ishmael is not her child, and he's not the child of promise. Through Abraham, God says, do what Sarah says. And so Hagar, the Egyptian handmaiden, has a skin of water put on her shoulders. I've mentioned, I think, in a Bible class that the way ancient people normally talked about a skin of water or of wine, they normally would take a small animal, like a goat, and tie off the legs, and then pour where the head opening was, and that was the skin of water. But you can see it would be pretty heavy to carry, and it would be a large amount of water. And so Abraham gave to Hagar a skin of water and some food, and she goes out wandering in the wilderness of Beersheba. The wilderness of Beersheba is mentioned several times. I suppose we should stop, and for the people of Israel, the wilderness just meant a dry area where nothing grew. But we are apt to think of a wilderness as a place where there are a lot of trees, a lot of lush forestation. But that was not true for the people of Israel. And so she wandered in the southern part of Israel. There is only dry land. Everything is a wilderness. And so for a while she wanders in the wilderness. She didn't want to have to see her child Ishmael die of thirst. And so it says she went some distance, about a bow shot, it says, and got far enough away from Ishmael so that she didn't have to watch him die. But God told her that he was going to bless Ishmael. Remember, Ishmael is about 14 years old at this time. Sarah has just born Isaac. And so God speaks, or an angel of God speaks to Hagar and tells her not to worry, that God is going to she's going to have enough food to eat, and so is Ishmael, and that God would make of Ishmael a great nation. And part of what Genesis is about, as it continues, is the descendants of Ishmael. A great people did come from the Ishmaelites. As I have mentioned before, the only time that I can think of the Ishmaelites cropping up is when the Ishmaelites were taking some trade goods down to the land of Egypt, and they bought Joseph along the way. And so Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites. But that's the only instance that I can think of where the Ishmaelites are mentioned. But they were apparently a great people, as the book of Genesis says, as it continues with that account. And so Abraham and Sarah have a child. They call his name Laughter. Isaac means, in Hebrew, laughter. Normally, we think of Sarah as the one laughing. Remember, in the 18th chapter, there were 3 men who wandered up to the place where Abraham was staying. And one of the 3 men is called Yahweh. One of them was the angel of God, I guess. Or else God appeared in the flesh at the time of Abraham. But as far as we know, all that's said of this person who appears in the 18th chapter, this 3rd angel, all that's said of him would make you think that he looked just like a man. But he is called Yahweh. 2 of the angels go on to Sodom and Gomorrah, and one of them stays behind, and Abraham bargains with him for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember the story. How will you save the city if there are 50 people? Suppose there are 10 lacking of the 50. Suppose there are only 40. Would you spare the city for 40? And God in each instance says yes, until they work all the way down to 10. But even 10 righteous can be found in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Sodom and Gomorrah, whether it was toward the south end of the Dead Sea or the north end of the Dead Sea, we'll let the scholars worry about. But at any rate, most people will agree that Sodom was a city that was somewhere in the range of where the Dead Sea is now. Sodom and Gomorrah have been found, the names have been found in other literature from the ancient Near East. And there's a lot of literature that's been discovered, most of it in the form of tablets written in cuneiform that just looks like a bunch of hen scratch to most of us. Well, Sarah and Abraham both had laughed, and so they named their son Laughter. And Isaac then was to be the son of promise. But before much is said about Isaac, it tells about Abraham going, because of famine again, went into the land of the Philistines. The Philistines lived to the south and the west, right along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And in the book of Judges, there are several times when 5 lords of the Philistines are mentioned. There were 5 cities that were prominent among the Philistines. They fell to foreign intruders, sort of one at a time. But the name Gaza we still speak about the Gaza Strip, and one of the cities was Gaza. So Abraham went over into that area. It is my opinion that the Philistines that we read of that Samson, for example, warred against, that the Philistines that are there are not the same Philistines that Abraham deals with. The word, the king that Abraham dealt with among the Philistines was Abimelech. And later on, Isaac deals with a king who is in that same area, and he also is named Abimelech. Abimelech means my father was a king, or something on that order. There is only one other place where an Abimelech appears in the Bible, and that is the son of Gideon. Gideon had one son who was not a very good man. He caused the death of all of the other sons of Gideon, and he was looking out for power for himself. And so the Abimelech that is mentioned in the book of Judges eventually dies and passes out of the picture. It is sort of odd that the only one of the judges that the people ask if he will be king is Gideon. And Gideon says, no, I won't be king over you. You've got a king who is the God of Israel. And he says, I won't be king. None of the judges wanted to be king, unless we count toward the end of Judges and the 5 chapters that are there. But Abimelech is the name of one of Gideon's sons. And you can see that if you were going to be the king of a people, if the people were to follow you, you had to have something about yourself that gave you the right to be a king. Well, if you said, my father was a king, then that would give you that right. In other words, I didn't usurp the throne or take it from somebody else. My father was a king, and when he died, I took over the inheritance. One of the problems with Ishmael and Isaac, one of the problems that they had to solve, was the problem of inheritance. It always was with an ancient people, especially when the land conditions were pretty harsh. But Isaac, Sarah said, I don't want Ishmael inheriting with my son, with Isaac. Isaac was the son of promise, and Ishmael, though he was the oldest son, and though the law was very strict about who the one was who was to inherit the property, the oldest son, nevertheless, in this instance, Isaac, the second son, became the heir of all that Abraham had. And it is interesting, I think, that of the 3, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, less is said about Isaac than any of the others. When there was no descendant from Abraham and Sarah, Abraham had his servant Eliezer of Damascus to travel north up into Haran and to find from his own family one who would be the heir, who would be the wife of Abraham's son Isaac. And so Eliezer of Damascus found Rebekah and brought her back, and she became the wife then of Isaac. I suppose that in sermons, most often we hear about Isaac and Rebekah in their favoring a child. Isaac favored Esau. Esau was the oldest child. And Isaac favored Esau. He was a hairy man, the Bible says in red. The word Edom and Esau both mean red in Hebrew. And so when Esau is born, he grows up to be an archer, and he kills animals of the desert. And so Isaac favors him because he brought into Isaac the kind of grain or game that he liked. But Rebekah favored Jacob. You remember how that went. How Esau tricks Jacob into getting both the birthright and the blessing of his father. The birthright he sold, that is, Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of pottage. And that's mentioned in Hebrews, and it's something that Christians tend to remember, how you take a thing of little value, like a pot of soup, and you trade it. You have to despise your birthright. And in the book of Hebrews, it talks about Esau despising his birthright. And Isaac then became both the heir of his father in physical terms, and also he bore the name of Isaac in spiritual terms. In time, of course, Abraham dies, and the two sons, Esau, or rather the two sons of Isaac, yes, Esau and Jacob, take him and bury him. He is buried in the cave of Machpelah that Abraham had bought whenever Sarah had died. And then the Bible tells about the death of Abraham. And so Isaac becomes the patriarch of the family. He has the two sons, you remember, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob becomes his chosen son. He becomes the seed of promise. He travels northward. He's going back to Haran too, to find a wife. Esau married some of the people of the land, and it was a vexation to Rebekah and Isaac. But Jacob is going back toward the land in Mesopotamia. And there's a large section in the book of Genesis that tells about Jacob's getting his two wives, Rachel and Leah, and the two concubines, and the children that are born to them. Eventually, Jacob takes over the territory. Esau travels on to the south. Esau and Edom, I said, meant red. And so the land south and east of Israel was traditionally the territory of the Edomites. But the territory that belonged to Abraham and his descendants was the land of Israel. And eventually they're all going to come to Egypt, but that's how that story develops. We'll study more of the significant events as we go along, but eventually all of the descendants of Jacob end up in the land of Egypt. Then they multiply over a period of 400 years or so and are led out as a great nation by Moses. And so that's where Genesis takes us. I hope you feel like that you're gaining some worthwhile information about Genesis as we go along through. And we'll still have a few more weeks that we'll be studying about the descendants of Abraham there. Thank you for your attention today.